Right. So promises. Does anyone? I'm sure you guys have heard of promises. Does anyone know anything about them?
Uh, the only thing I know about them is like that it's like in some ways like similar to um like a conditional statement. Like there's like a truthy and falsy and like you're kind of like it's like waiting for a return. It's like if it doesn't get something in time, then the promise is like not upheld or something.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're right in that a promise can basically have two states. I mean, technically three states, but the end result will be one of two states. So either succeed or will fail. Um, and that's usually called resolved, like resolved or rejected. So a promise is something that you want to happen that might return a value later. So I want something to happen, but I don't want to wait around and sit here waiting for a result. I'm just going to kind of do the thing and send it off. And then once that result comes back, whether it's a successful result or a failure, then I want to, you know, do something with it. And so you guys just made a web page where you made, I don't know how many, 10 or so API requests. So if you go on Twitter or something like that, and you look in your network tab while you're doing that, you will see all kinds of crazy requests going out constantly. Um, you know, dozens, hundreds, and so there's all kinds of these requests going out. And if it were the case that you had to stop and wait for every single one, then you would never be able to do anything. Like pages wouldn't load. Anytime you scroll down, the page would freeze while everything had to load. And then once it was loaded, then it would be good, and then you could scroll some more. So it would basically make interacting with web pages prohibitively time consuming. So I have to make a call here and then wait for a result to get back. And then if I do make another call to somewhere else, then that gets back, and then I do something with it. Then I make another call, and we don't think about these as being time consuming, but in a relative sense, they are very time consuming operations. So if you talk about computing some value in JavaScript, it happens basically instantly. Whereas making a network request takes forever in relative terms. So a request, it takes 300 milliseconds to go out, and then gets processed, and then another 300 or so milliseconds to come back. I mean, you're talking about something that could take half a second or a second, which is not much on its own. But if you have lots and lots of these requests, then that starts adding up. So you don't want to block. You don't want to block the thread. And JavaScript is single threaded, basically. So, as I'm executing JavaScript, I execute a line, and when that's finished, I go to the next one. So it's just like the call stack, right? I execute a function, it gets put on the call stack executes it, it gets removed from the call stack. Then I move on to the next line, right? So that's basically how this works. But there's an escape hatch, basically. So there's an escape hatch which allows you to not block the thread. And that escape hatch, one of them is basically the promise API. So it allows you to, like, I want to do something, and so I put it on, I put it on the call stack, I execute it, but I kind of hand it off to something else. And then I can keep going. I can keep executing the rest of the JavaScript while I wait for this other thing to happen. So today I would view this as some initial exposure. Promises, it's one of those things that it takes a while, like asynchronous programming in general. It's a complicated thing, or it can be complicated. It's kind of hard to wrap your mind around. It's not intuitive. Having said that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So a promise is a class, and you can create an instance of a promise. So I'm going to do that right now. So I use the new keyword to create an instance. So in Python, you don't need this new keyword to create an instance, but in JavaScript, you do. So here I'm creating a new instance of a promise. And the promise constructor, the equivalent of the init function in Python, it needs a function. So I'm going to create an instance of this promise class. And in order to do that, I have to give it a function. And that function, actually, I'll do this separately just so it's easier to see. It is a function. And this function will take two parameters. And these two parameters are also functions. So we're really getting in the weeds now. The first one is conventionally called resolve. And the second one is reject. And I'm going to pass this here. So when you create a promise, you create an instance of a promise and you pass it a function. And this function takes two parameters, which conventionally are called resolve and reject. And resolve and reject are both functions. So it's an object, or it's an object that takes a function that takes in two functions. So lots of fun here. And then in the body of this is where you're going to try and do whatever it is that you actually want to do, which could be making some HTTP request somewhere, or trying to read in a file, or it could really be anything. I'm just going to kind of mock this a little bit. So I'm gonna use set timeout. So it's a way of kind of delaying a little bit. So I'm gonna use set. Actually, the first time I'm not gonna do that. First time I'll keep it simple. And then so what you would do inside the body of this function is whatever business logic you have. And as you do the business logic, you decide, like if something succeeds, then I'm going to call resolve. Otherwise, if it fails, I'm going to call reject. So I'll just write a conditional here. So and else. So in the body of this function, we are going to do whatever business logic, which could be anything. We're just kind of going to create a dummy value here. And then if we get a good outcome, or the outcome that we want or expect, then we call resolve and we pass in whatever value is appropriate. And if it's not successful, there's a problem or some kind of error occurs, there's a failure, then we call reject and we pass in the error message. So that's basically, that's how you make a promise. So now we'll just take a look at this. So console.log my promise. It's not Python. So we call this promise, and we can see there's a string representation here, but we can't actually do anything with it. So ultimately my goal is to do something with this value that I'm returning. We're focusing on the happy case right now. So my ultimate goal is to like, this is like the JSON data that you got, right? Or this is like the data from the file that you read, or the information from the database. So we want to do something with this value, but how do we access that value? We have this promise right here, but I don't want the promise itself. I want to get inside the promise and grab that value and do something with it. Unfortunately, you can't exactly do that. So I'm going to call here, I'm going to say console.log. And I'm going to do okay. So if I run this code, what do we think is going to get displayed in the console?
Success path, success, and then end code.
Okay, so let's go ahead and run it. We get success path and end of code. So this actually gets, when you pass it the function, it actually runs immediately. So the function that you pass to my promise will get run immediately. I'm actually going to take this, yeah. I'm going to do this because this is how you'll typically see it. So I'm going to comment this out. Okay. So I have this this promise, and if I want to actually access the value itself, what I can do is I call my promise, and then I have to call another function, which is .then. So .then will keep me, I'm still inside the promise world. I'm still inside this parallel universe. And I then takes yet another function, which will be executed. And the parameter, I'll just call X for now. So X will be whatever I return from this resolve statement. So console.log X. So now I'm going to run this. We get something that's a little different. So I have this promise, and I want to get at the value. So now I can get at the value, right? I actually printed out the success. So this X, that's this value right here. So I am actually able to grab it. But now I have this weird behavior where I ran this, and now it's like the last line is printing first, and then this other thing. So it's a bit wonky. And it's a bit wonky in part because anytime you have a promise, you should think of this as being in a separate universe. This is occurring, all this business is occurring in a separate universe. The rest of this synchronous code here can't really interact with anything. Once it's in async world, it's in async world. That's it. It's blasted off to the moon. It's in another world. You can't do anything with it directly. The only way to do something with a promise is basically this. You can just chain, .then. You can do whatever. So you can take a promise that does something and then it makes another call. So if this were a call to an API, you could take that API call and then make another API call and return another promise. Then you would do .then. So you can chain these together. But what you kind of want to do intuitively is say, const x equals this thing, and then I want to do something, console log x or whatever. But that just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. You can't use asynchronous code in the rest of your synchronous code. Any questions about this so far? Okay. All right. So this is the basic, and let's say, for example, that this is a failure. So now I'm going to make this false. So this represents, I try to make the API call, but there's a network problem or some other failure. And now I get this very scary message saying unhandled promise rejection. It tells me this error originated either by throwing inside of an async function without a catch block, we'll talk about that in a second, or by rejecting a promise which was not handled with .catch. So we have a happy path and a sad path. We've just talked about the happy path, which is handled with .then. We can also handle the sad path with .catch. And this time it will be an error. And I'll just console.error. I'm gonna clean this up just a little bit. Still really need to assign this. So I added a .catch here, and now when there's a failure, that failure can be handled here. So just in this case, I'm just printing out the error message. But both .then and .catch take a callback function, which will be executed. So if you call resolve, then this one will be executed. If you call reject, then this one will be executed. Okay, so now I'm going to make this a little more realistic looking. So instead of just calling resolve directly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use set timeout. Set timeout. So set timeout will take a function which will be executed after some period in milliseconds. So 3000 milliseconds. And what do I want to do in this function? Well, I can actually do the exact same thing that I had. So if true, resolve, else reject. So now when I run this, should get basically the same behavior, but it's going to take a second, which will kind of imitate making an API call. And again, if I console log end will get called immediately. So this is not blocking. This is not blocking the JavaScript evaluation loop. The JavaScript, I can like execute this, hand it off, and forget about it, and execute the rest of the code. So, and then meanwhile, whenever that resolves, I can bring it back in and do something with the value. So that's the whole point. Okay. So we have this, and again, if I do this, if I make this false, this represents some kind of failure happening, it's going to wait 3 seconds or so, and then you give me the error message. All right, so now that we have a promise, so this is like the the lower level. This is a promise, and then we have this dot then dot catch. We also have, as we've been looking at today, this syntax sugar. So I can do async get my promise. Let's go through. And then I'm going to comment this out. And I'm going to return my promise. And I call this. And what is this going to return? Well, I'm getting some type hints here. It tells me that it returns a promise. So this function, which I've marked as async, returns a promise. So because this returns a promise, I can call this, I don't think I'm going to see anything. It will still take a second. And I get an unhandled rejection. So I want to make this, I'll talk about that in a second. But this code is still going to evaluate, but it's not really, we're not getting any of the output. So how do we get at the success from this point? Well, we can do the same thing we did here. We can do dot then, and then pass in a callback function, console.log x. And this is the same thing. Again, this is just a function that returns a promise. And then because this is a promise, we call dot then and dot catch on it. Alternatively, if we want to do something with that value inside of this function, we can do that. So const value equals await, and then I'm gonna I don't think I need to call this actually, and then I'm gonna do console.log value. So now I'm gonna call get promise. And you see the success actually gets console logged here. So this is just syntactic sugar for this. So if you have something that returns a promise and you want to use it inside this function, then you mark this the outside of the function with async, and then you mark whatever returns a promise with await. And then you can use the value. You can write it as though it were synchronous code, even though it's really doing this under the hood.
So is that like why the old way to call APIs, I think, is like using try catch or whatever, and then now we can use await, or is it not that related?
So it is, but actually, here's where you use try catch. So here, if you use the dot then dot catch, this is the syntax you use. If you want to use the async await syntax sugar, then you have to use try catch. So you use try. This is what you want to do. And then I'll console log value. And then you use catch. And get the error. And then I can do console error. And then the error message. So I'll just run this. This is still the happy path. It should work exactly the same. And now I will make this fail. and we get the error message. So before this error message we got, it said the error originated by either throwing blah blah blah. So either throwing it inside an async function without a catch block, which is what we had before, or by rejecting a promise which was not handled with .catch. So you have two options. One, you can use this syntax where you're chaining .then .catch, or you can use the async await and then use the try catch like that. But I just want to emphasize that once you're in promise world, you can't escape. So if I do any other synchronous code that I write, any other normal code that I write here, can't do anything with this value. So the reverse is true. So I can call synchronous code from asynchronous code. So I can have another method. I'll call this function get sync value. This will return I can do this, and this should work just fine. It gets the success value. So I can call a synchronous function from an asynchronous function, but I can't do the reverse. Any questions about that? All right, that's pretty much all I wanted to go over. So that's what a promise is. For the purposes of the course, you really just need to know how to use the fetch API, which is pretty straightforward. I think everyone basically has it figured out. I would suggest spending some time reading up on promises to try and wrap your head around it, because it's it's a more advanced concept, but it's also it's something that you can get asked in an interview, for example. Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording.